Welcome to Chapter 3 of our Math 9. Our Chapter 3 involves quadratic equations, inequalities, and quadratic functions. All of these topics are related. Quadratic equations and inequalities will be used when we analyze what these quadratic functions are. And our lesson 3.1 will be the methods in solving quadratic equations. For our objective here, we want to identify what these methods are in solving quadratic equations. But first, let's have the definition of a quadratic equation. A quadratic equation in X is an equation of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a is not equal to 0 and a, b, c element real. We require that a is not equal to 0 because if a becomes 0, this equation becomes linear in X. This form here we call the standard form. To solve a quadratic equation means to find the value of X here that will make our left hand side equal to 0. And there are several methods in arriving at the value of X for such an equation. Okay, so these are the methods. First method, using the square root property. What is this square root property? We have if x squared equals p, then we can have this become linear by saying that x equals square root of p or x equals negative square root of p. Next method, using the definition of absolute value. What's the definition of absolute value? We have square root of x squared is equal to the absolute value of x. Then, if we are on this form, we will now use the theorem absolute value of x equals p for p greater or equal to 0 implies that x equals p or x equals negative p. Method C here is using factoring method. Factoring method makes use of this theorem. If p times q equals 0, then p equals 0 or q equals 0. This is the zero product property. If p times q equals 0, then p equals 0 or q equals 0. Next method, using completing the square method. Using the completing the square method. And from the completing the square method, we can either make use of extracting roots or definition of absolute value to complete this method. And the last method will be using the quadratic formula. We will be deriving the quadratic formula using again completing the square. So you see, if we are given this quadratic equation here, you have several ways of solving it. And the choice of method will depend on what is required by your instructor. But if there's nothing required, then you can just choose the most convenient method to use given a particular problem. So the first method is square root property, using the square root property. Second method is using the definition of absolute value. Third method is using factoring method. Fourth, using completing the square. And fifth, using the quadratic formula. For the next lesson that we will have, we will be using the first two methods to solve quadratic equations. These two methods are very similar to each other. The first method is using the square root property, and the second method is using the definition of absolute value. I will see you on the next lesson. Thank you.